Athens in the early 1st century BCE remained the undisputed center of the philosophical world. At the time, Plato's famous school, the Academy, was led by Philo of Larissa. Under his direction, the institution championed a specific intellectual posture: mitigated skepticism. Mitigated skepticism is an approach that rejects the teaching of absolute, dogmatic truth in favor of systematic inquiry. The academics suspended absolute judgment, arguing that perfect certainty was unattainable. Instead of building rigid systems of their own, they used dialectical arguments to poke holes in the absolute claims of their rivals, particularly the Stoics. They would adopt their opponents' premises to deduce unwelcome conclusions, proving that those dogmatic systems were internally flawed. To these academics, maintaining a systematic suspension of judgment served as an intellectual safeguard against the errors of dogmatism. Antiochus of Ascalon was a loyal student of Philo for years before executing a sudden, radical intellectual rebellion against him. He embraced what the academics called dogmatism, the belief that absolute knowledge is not only possible but actively attainable by human beings. Antiochus argued he was not inventing a new philosophy. He claimed he was merely reviving the original, uncorrupted doctrines of Plato's early successors, what he called the Old Academy. His contemporaries noticed an immediate contradiction. Antiochus is building his new version of Platonism using the exact epistemological and ethical frameworks of his school's fiercest rivals, the Stoics and the Peripatetics. He justified this by arguing that Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, had merely updated the terminology of the original academy with a few minor corrections. This historical argument allowed Antiochus to legally smuggle Stoic ideas directly back into Plato's school. By weaponizing the history of philosophy, Antiochus engineered a retroactive continuity. He legitimized a hybrid system by convincing his peers it was the ancient, original truth. The core of this debate centered on the criterion of truth, the standard by which we judge reality. This animated diagram shows the academic skeptics model on the left, where incoming data passes through a filter of probable impressions, persuasive but uncertain data, leading to provisional action without absolute belief. Antiochus rejected this for the strict Stoic model, seen on the right. He demanded a cognitive impression, an impression stamped into the mind in exact accordance with reality, possessing a special character that proves it could not come from what is false. Only perfect matches pass through to become true knowledge. Antiochus attacked the skeptical model on two fronts. First, he argued that claiming nothing can be known is self-refuting, because asserting that position requires you to take yourself to know at least one thing. Second, he targeted the practical mechanics of living. He argued that human action is functionally impossible without absolute assent, the definitive acceptance of an impression as true. To Antiochus, a probable impression was an inadequate substitute for a cognitive grasp of reality. A standard that merely invites approval cannot serve as a reliable engine for human judgment. He concluded that without adopting the strict Stoic criteria for knowledge, human beings are left paralyzed. Without absolute cognitive impressions, it is impossible to avoid error, making true wisdom unattainable. In 88 BCE, political instability in Athens forced Philo to move his operations to Rome. There, he published a pair of texts known as the Roman Books, attempting a strategic philosophical compromise. Philo now claimed that the Academy had never actually been skeptical. Instead, he argued that previous academics only meant to prove that apprehension is impossible under the impossibly strict Stoic definition, not that human knowledge itself is impossible. Antiochus, reading these works while visiting Alexandria, was outraged. He authored the Sosis, a stinging written riposte aimed directly at his former teacher's new position. Antiochus argued that Philo's compromise, lowering the standard for knowledge to impressions that are merely true and accurate, without the Stoic guarantee, destroys the very definition of apprehension.
If an impression doesn't have a unique marker distinguishing it from a false one, it cannot provide a secure basis for judgment. For Antiochus, there could be no middle ground. A philosopher must either accept the full, uncompromised Stoic definition of a cognitive impression or admit total ignorance. This rigid demand for certainty extended into the second pillar of Hellenistic philosophy, ethics. To determine the ultimate goal of human life, Antiochus utilized a popular analytical method known as the cradle argument. The cradle argument observes the behavior of uncorrupted infants to isolate our original natural impulses before society shapes them. This diagram outlines the Stoic application of the argument. It shows that infants do not naturally seek pleasure, but rather natural advantages, things like physical health, bodily integrity, and well-functioning senses. But the Stoics introduce a severe twist. As humans mature and develop reason, their motives must undergo a radical psychological transformation, realizing that these original biological advantages are entirely indifferent. The rigid Stoic conclusion is that virtue, identical with perfect wisdom, is the sole human good. Physical well-being, wealth, or health cannot add a single drop of value to a happy life. This ethical model demands a counterintuitive split. It alienates adult reason from foundational human biology, suggesting the very things we are born needing eventually cease to matter. Antiochus accepted the mechanics of the cradle argument, but he rejected the Stoic conclusion that our early biological needs suddenly become indifferent. To correct this, he pulled a different philosophical doctrine into his system, sourced from the Peripatetics, the followers of Aristotle, and claimed it was the original stance of the old Academy's Palomo. His logic was straightforward. Whatever agrees with a creature's fully developed adult nature, as expressed in its natural impulses, must be considered a genuine good for that creature. He established the premise that while reason is undoubtedly the highest and most important part of human nature, it is not the only part. We possess physical bodies that require care. To reconcile this, Antiochus introduced a unique two-tiered ethical solution. This hierarchical pyramid illustrates his system, starting with the large base tier labeled virtue, which equates to the baseline happy life, or vita beata. He adopted the Stoic requirement that virtue is entirely sufficient to achieve this baseline happiness. A virtuous person is a happy person, regardless of their physical state. But he added an upper tier. To achieve the completely happy life, the vita beatissima, a person requires the addition of bodily and external goods, like health and strength, resting on top of that virtuous base. The inclusion of these Aristotelian external goods was necessary to create an ethical system designed for actual human biology, rather than an impossible ideal of a perfect Stoic sage. The completed architecture of Antiochus's philosophy was a masterful hybrid. It offered Stoic epistemological certainty in the mind, combined with peripatetic realism for the physical body. The historical audacity of this project is striking. He packaged this massive, synthesized engine of rival thoughts and successfully sold it to the world under the label of Plato's Old Academy. This highly structured, pragmatic system held massive appeal for the practical mindset of the Roman intellectual and political elite. Prominent statesmen like Cicero, Varro, and Brutus studied and engaged deeply with Antiochus's framework. Following his rebellion, the Academy's 3-century commitment to skepticism came to an end. It would never return to its former probabilistic methods. By merging these rival systems, Antiochus established the dogmatic and syncretic foundation for Middle Platonism, defining the school's trajectory for the next 2 centuries. Antiochus demonstrates a recurring pattern in intellectual history. Some of the most radical structural changes are executed under the banner of strict historical restoration.